Welcome to the latest episode of the Real World Nutrition Podcast. This is episode 240, When Science Meets Politics. What happened to the Advisory Committee's recommendations? Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Real World Nutrition Podcast. This episode is the final episode, at least for now, related to the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. So I've covered quite a bit in the last several weeks, including a history of the Dietary Guidelines and what stayed the same and what has changed. Also referring to the most recent edition of the Dietary Guidelines, the 2025-2030, and what they got right and where they fell short. Also addressed a whole episode on what moderation really means when it comes to alcohol and your health, because this is a section of the Dietary Guidelines that shifted, and I'll address it a little bit again today. And then last week's episode was how the Dietary Guidelines are made and why that process matters. And this is somewhat a part two of that episode when we talk about what happens to those advisory committee guidelines or recommendations and what happens specifically with this most recent edition of the Dietary Guidelines. So because there often is questions at least for most of us who know how this works behind the scenes, what happens when the science and the final policy or the final release written guidelines don't fully align, because that does happen. And this isn't new with this most recent edition. It just felt more glaring this time. But I do want to say, of course, it does happen all the time, just there wasn't as much of a spotlight in the past. So just a little bit about where science meets policy. So in the last episode, I talked about how the guidelines are developed and how that independent advisory committee comes together, reviews the scientific evidence, produces a detailed report, and the steps related to that. And that report is extensive. And extensive, that's not really meant for the general public to review. I'm not saying that you can't. It is completely available and transparent for people to review. It's just, frankly, pretty boring and very, very long, because it includes systematic reviews, data analysis, conclusions based on research. And then, as I said in last week's episode, the federal agencies then will take that report from the advisory committee and then translate it into the final dietary guidelines. And that's where things tend to shift or maybe look a little different from what the advisory committee report said. So again, the advisory committee report is not final policy document. It informs final policy, but it is not identical to it. And often I should say, the alignment is very close, but sometimes there are differences in wording, emphasis, and even what makes it into the final document. And the most recent edition that came out in January of 2026 has some pretty clear examples of how that plays out. So I'm going to cover a handful of those and talk about where the Advisory Committee's report, based on evidence, had wording in the final document that was pretty different. So first up, saturated fat, the language around saturated fat. So the Advisory Committee reviewed a large body of evidence supporting the recommendation to limit saturated fat and, this is important, replace it with unsaturated fat to reduce cardiovascular risk. And this is not new. It's been consistent for decades. And it's those two things together. So not just limiting saturated fat, but the importance of replacing them with the healthier fats, not sugar and not having low fat everything. And in the final guidelines, the numerical limit stayed the same. So less than 10% of our total calories should come from saturated fat. But then there was wording that shifted here too. So the final guidelines said this, but then there was other wording where there was more language suggesting there's uncertainty in some areas of this evidence. And that made me not seem like a big deal, but really the wording there, it matters. when the policy language introduces doubt, even subtly, and people may not have noticed this, but it was glaring in my professional opinion. So that policy came out saying, well, we need better research. We need more strong research that said this. Well, we've got strong research and decades of research that do show extremely strong correlation that saturated fat in high amounts is not healthy for us. And if we replace it with the unsaturated fats, that's better. But when that policy language, as I said, introduces doubt, it can influence how we talk about it as professionals, when I say we as a dietitian, and then how the public understands it. Because they may say, well, wait, I thought we don't have good research, when we do. And the underlying science did not disappear. It's there. It still is there. And you can look at the advisory committee's findings if you want to go there. But the tone of the recommendation in the final release of the dietary guidelines was much more cautious, going, yeah, we're not quite sure, when we're pretty darn sure about that one. Another one was talking about whole grains and processing. So let's talk grains. The advisory committee's report emphasized increasing whole grains and improving fiber intake. This isn't new. That's been there for a while. The final guidelines, though, also encouraged prioritizing fiber-rich whole grains and reducing certain refined grain products. And where things got interesting was how this was framed. So the advisory committee focused primarily on grain quality and overall dietary pattern. But the final document of the dietary guidelines introduced very direct language around highly processed grain products and even named specific examples like flour tortillas. Now, I'm not saying to ignore highly processed grain products. Yeah, highly processed grain products should be limited, but to call out specific examples is... there's some nuance here we've got to talk about. So we had the clarity, reduce highly processed grains, but we want to include whole grains, high in fiber. But what we want to pay attention to here is not all refined grains are the same, because while you may not think flour tortillas are important, we do have to pay attention to culturally relevant foods. If you've looked at the United States, we are a mix of multiple ethnicities, and we have culturally relevant foods. We said, okay, you can't have clam chowder because it's not healthy. That's not going to fly in some parts of the United States. So to say, remove flour tortillas because they're highly processed grains, that's not what people are going to take kindly to in some areas. So it raises questions about context of culturally relevant foods and how people will interpret those recommendations in real life. So the core idea is that we need to eat more whole grains. We need to include fiber in our diet. We need to reduce the highly processed grain products. But to say your culturally relevant food should be removed is not fair. And we want to communicate it appropriately. It fits into an overall eating pattern as long as it's not all of your grains. Now, I'm going to cover alcohol again. I said I mentioned it a couple of episodes ago, but some people might have skipped that episode, and I'm not going to cover it all over again. But this, again, was one of the more noticeable changes on alcohol guidance. So a recap. The previous guidelines always included specific limits. Up to 1 drink per day for women, up to 2 drinks a day for men. And those numbers were widely used. Clinical settings, public health messaging, media coverage, even the American Heart Association and American Cancer Society used these same numbers. In the most recent version of the dietary guidelines, the numbers are gone, completely gone. The guidance says now to consume less alcohol for better health. And that's significant. Again, I covered that a couple episodes ago. The science behind this change reflects growing evidence linking alcohol to increased risk of certain cancers, even at lower levels of intake, even with the different types of alcohol. So there's more understanding how earlier research suggesting there was cardiovascular benefits may have been influenced by other factors. So the risk of moderate intake, as defined the 1 or 2 drinks per day, is less forgiving than what we previously thought. But here's the problem here, is removing those numbers introduces some ambiguity here. Ask 100 people, what does it mean to consume less alcohol? What does that mean to you? What does that mean to an individual? Less than what? Less than what I was drinking before? Less than what the average is? Less than what was previously recommended? Having worked in this area, not just with alcohol, but when I ask people, have less of this, they need to have very specific guidance or they will interpret it how they want. So from my perspective as a health professional, those numbers are helpful tools. For the public, it helps provide something concrete. They hear a number. They can blow it off if they want. They can laugh at it, but it's a defined number. And without them, we've got messaging that can be open to interpretation. Now, I touched on this one already, but I'm going to go into it a little bit more, is cultural representation. Another shift that's worth noting is the reduced emphasis on cultural diversity. So earlier versions of the guidelines clearly acknowledged that we are not nutritionally uniform in the United States. Past guidelines include cultural food patterns, regional differences, importance of tailoring recommendations. So when I say regional differences, kind of what I say is, hey, what does barbecue mean to you depending on where you're from? Because if you've got Texas and you've got Kansas City and you've got Tennessee and you've got North Carolina, those are different. I'm not saying we're talking about barbecue here. I'm just giving an example of cultural food patterns. Where I live in a landlocked state in the high desert, we're not going to talk about seafood of the Northwest or the New England area. We've got cultural differences, cultural food patterns, the regional differences. So in this most recent version, that language is not only less visible, it's pretty much gone. So core recommendations are broadly applicable to everybody, but the explicit acknowledgement of cultural context has been scaled back. And that's really important. That's really something we want to consider because food is not just nutrients. Food is culture. Food is tradition, access, lived experiences. Food is more than just the nutrients. And when guidance doesn't reflect that or appreciate that, it can feel less relevant. Oh, they're not talking to me, so I'm not going to pay attention to it. So these are just I said a handful. These were a few things that are noted in the most recent edition of the guidelines. But truly, this is not a new thing. So yeah, this may sound concerning, but it is important to understand this has happened in the past. So for example, in the 2015 guidelines, so the ones that were released 10 years ago or more than 10 years ago, the advisory committee included a discussion on sustainability and environmental impact, and those did not make it into the final guidelines. I alluded to this in a previous episode. There was a discussion about reducing red meat and processed meat. And the final document avoided direct language on that topic. So this pattern's been around for a while. Scientific review points us in one direction, but policy's going to take a more measured path, sometimes based on lobbyists. I shouldn't say sometimes, it's often based on lobbying. So that leads me to the next part. Why does this happen? Well, it's a few reasons. So I mentioned one of them already, but I'll get into that. Why do these changes happen? Why is there a shift from the advisory committee report to the final policy? In industry influence, they've got cash. So food and beverage companies have a stake in how these recommendations are written. I said they got cash, but also public comment period. Organizations can weigh in. I mentioned the public comment period in last week's episode. I can weigh in. My professional organization can weigh in. Anybody can weigh in, whether it's a company, an organization, an industry group, and those comments can carry influence because if each one of the employees of that industry group, as well as the industry, as well as various stores or product lines, can all chime in. But also the feasibility here. We're talking about guidelines that are meant to apply to a very large and diverse population in the United States. And we're still a diverse population. We still are. So recommendations that are scientifically strong may not be always practical for everyone. And then there's the politics. These are federal policy documents. They go through a process that includes oversight and approval on multiple levels. And this is not unique to nutrition. It happens in other areas of public health and policy as well. Science exists within a larger system. So what the scientists reviewing the research, conducting the research, making the recommendations have to say doesn't always make it to the final recommendations, not just with the dietary guidelines, but in other areas as well. So what does this mean when it comes to trust? Who do we trust? What should we pay attention to? Well, this is the part where it gets tricky. It gets tricky. It really, really gets tricky. When people see or hear about the differences between the advisory committee report and the final guidelines, it can be like, so what's going on here? Who are we supposed to pay attention to? Some people see this as evidence that the guidelines are compromised. When we've got industry influence and politics and people who have special interests, well, let's ignore them. But then others point out, as I have, that the core recommendations have remained relatively consistent over time. They have. If we go back to 1980, more fruits and vegetables, whole grains, appropriate protein, less sugar, moderate amounts of alcohol. So there's the nuances that are different, but the big picture perspective, the big picture recommendations are the same. The foundational themes have stayed the same. So I was like my notes here. So I said some of these already. Eat more fruits and vegetables. Choose whole grains. Include lean proteins. Use unsaturated fats. Limit sugars, sodium, saturated fats. Those are the messages that have been consistent across decades. I've been not paying much attention to the sodium. No particular reason. Just that one has just been pretty consistent over time. I also want to address a couple other things here. Acceptable versus optimal. So that's another concept here that's helpful. The difference between optimal and acceptable. Optimal nutrition in a research setting doesn't always translate to real life. Policy, when it comes to policy, the consideration has to be what is realistic for large populations. We can have a beautifully placed recommendation on what our meals and eating patterns should look like. But then we've got real life. Access to food, how much food costs, cultural preferences, our daily routines. What are we doing day to day? Who has time for some of this? So we've got that flexibility. So the guidelines are often there to aim for improvements that are achievable at a population level rather than some idealized standard. And people may want to pick and nitpick, which I have done with this, but we've got to get this into consideration. People are going to eat how they want to eat. And so if we can nudge them in a better direction, a healthier direction, that's great. And that can be frustrating if somebody wants the strongest possible interpretation of science. We've got some great interpretation of science, but if I'm telling people to not eat red meat, which is fine for some people, and eat a lot more fish, that's not going to fly with some segments of the population. So from a public health perspective, encouraging these small shifts across millions of people can have a significant impact. Have less red meat or have red meat less often. I know I'm talking about that vague term that I was crabbing about when it comes to alcohol. Have a little bit more fish. Have more fish. I mean, there's just all these little things that we have to take into consideration, and we've got to be broad. So with that, as I'm wrapping up this section, this series in the podcast about the dietary guidelines, we have to remember this sits at an intersection of science, policy, culture, and economics. And that's a big one right now. So it's not, the guidelines aren't one or the other. Let's talk science and science alone and not think about the access and economics of things. So we understand these different things. That's not meaning we're dismissing them. We're not dismissing science. We're not dismissing economics. We have to look at them as a collective, looking at them with a more informed perspective. Remember, the guidelines are a tool, a framework, a starting point, not rules. Like anything in nutrition, context matters. Always remember this, not one food, not one meal, not one day, but an overall pattern of eating is what matters most. Okay, with that, this is wrapping up this series. I'm including a link in the show notes for the blog related to this. You can go in the last several episodes of the podcast where I covered the dietary guidelines. I believe it's 6 episodes now. And then the link in the show notes, I have the longer series of the dietary guidelines for Americans, these various perspectives. You can click on one, and at the bottom, all of the other ones are linked there. All right. With that, I've got some slightly different direction I'm going in with the podcast, not anything other than different topics is what I mean. So with that, thanks for listening again. I hope you enjoyed this series, or at least that you learned from it. And let me know if you have questions or ideas for podcast topics. All right, everyone, take care and bye for now.